I've already finished the bottom of the power truck and now ready to move to the top. But before we leave the bottom, I've already got that reassembled. And you'll recall from the previous still photography, you could see the parts that I had taken out. I disengaged these 4 screws, and that allowed me to free up the truck side and coupler assembly, which is this piece plus the coupler. Just dropped it off. Did nothing more than just the washing and any other cleaning that needed to be done. That exposed the pull-more wheel, axle, and gear assembly, which are these. They looked identical to the ones on the back truck, except, of course, they had the plastic gear on the center of the axle. Again, nothing more than the standard washing, then cleaning, then polishing of the contact wheels and other components, specifically the axle. However, this time I pulled, in collaboration with the owner, we pulled the existing pull-more wheels off and replaced them with Portland's wheels. Now these are aluminum, so the color changes a little bit, but I've had very good results with these on all of my diesel locomotion. So I put these on, spaced them properly, pulled them with a wheel puller, pushed them on with a vice grip, squared them up, and they're in place, ready to go. So they were in place and ready. The next thing it allowed me to do was to pull the worm gear, the worm shaft and gear, which is on the other side of the axles, and the worm shaft bearings. Now this will be so apparent when you pull this off, and you can see it in the still photography. The bearings are on either end. One thing I've noticed is that while A.C. Gilbert cuts back on a lot of parts over time as he moves forward with these trains, one of the things he didn't cut back on this train was washers. There's washers on either end of the worm shaft and gear assembly. Make sure you put those back. They are in specific locations to keep the shaft from bumping up against the bearing. So make sure those are back in place. Again, standard washing and cleaning and so forth to get that in place. Then I simply reversed it. I put the bearings back on the end of the worm gear axle, the worm shaft and gear axle, dropped it into place, very simple, made sure it had proper lubrication within the bearings with gear lube, and then dropped the axles back in. No alignment is needed, although this time I centered the gears, what I think is a little bit better on the worm gear, by closing the wheels just a tad. These were set surprisingly wide apart, wider than normal, much wider than the dime test. So I squeezed them just a little bit tighter to ensure proper negotiation of turns, alignment of the gears, and so forth. So dropped all that back in with proper lubrication, reset the axles back on top of the gears, and then just closed it up by putting the truck side and coupler assembly back on. By the way, these are the wheels. And they turned out to be grooved. So, again, in concert with the owner, I told him that we would replace them with these grooved pull-more tires. You'll notice that they are considerably thicker than the thinner tire that wraps around some of the wheels that are not grooved and that are pull-more wheels. So I'll be able to pull these off and replace them with these. And I feel very confident that these can be repurposed on another train. Even if the white insulator breaks, I have spares and I can push those back in. The next step will be the disassembly and servicing of the motor once I get the bottom rebuilt. All that constitutes is removing 2 screws from the front. The brush bracket assembly can then be slid out. The springs that hold the brushes can be disengaged. I'll be able to get to the brushes and to the armature and to the commutator, which is the drum style. I'll also be able to inspect the armature and inspect the interior of the field. I don't think that I will disassemble this, because this only thing that this constitutes is disassembly of releasing this from the frame. Now, if that's what's required to drop the armature completely out, I might do that. So it's 2 screws. This releases this from the frame. We should be able to get to the back of the armature. 2 screws up front release the brush bracket assembly. and allow that to be slid forward. This screw right here is the one that holds these springs on right here that hold the brush holders in place and applies the pressure. Once that's done, it'll be a matter of simple reassembly and completing the lubrication. By the way, on the chassis assembly, before I drop the axles back in, I made certain that the bushings for these axles was adequately lubricated with a gear lube, not a low viscosity, but a higher viscosity lubrication to make sure, or to ensure, a little bit smoother operation. I had always dreaded taking apart, disassembling a Baldwin and doing the maintenance on it, simply because I understood just from discussions that these were considerably more difficult. So far, I've been very pleased that they're not that much more difficult, if at all. As a matter of fact, I like their modularity. I wanted to see if I could gain access to the field and to the armature simply by removing this piece right here, which is the bush and bearing cap. It's accessed simply by removing the two long screws. Very easy to get to. But that was not enough. While it does loosen this up, it doesn't allow you to pull this out in order to gain access to either end, freely to either end of where the armature is mounted. So what I had to do was remove the screws that hold the bearing and mount assembly, which is this piece right here, in place. Now once I did that, and that's these two screws right here, it was pretty easy just to drop it out. What you'll reveal when you do that is this bearing piece and its washer. Again, pay careful attention as to where these come from. This was on the head end or the commutator end of the armature, and I just need to have those go back into place where they came from. Once that was done, I was able to get the major components apart, separated so that I could work on them, and that included the surface of the chassis assembly. It included the interior of the field and anything around it. It also included the very, very important to me interior of this bearing and mount assembly, because that's where a lot of the carbon dust is going to collect. It allowed me also to get to the tip end of and check, as a matter of fact, the brushes, and then of course work on cleaning the commutator and doing some fine polishing on it. Now, if anything, this one needs to be ground a little bit. This is probably the deepest groove, although you may not be able to see it with a naked eye. But if you hold it up very, very close, you can see some slight rounded grooving in this commutator. It means that the brushes are making good contact, and it means they're consistent in their contact location. So that's important, but it still has a little bit of a groove effect. I, of course, cleaned the slots thoroughly, and they were pretty dirty with carbon dust. So this isn't a whole lot different than any other diesel or even steam locomotive in principle. All the metal parts were thoroughly cleaned and excess grease removed. The armature was clean. Now, I did not remove this plastic tooth gear right here, which is on the long end of the armature shaft. And without taking that off, and there is risk to me in removing anything that's plastic in that it may fracture, it does not allow me to get to that longest part of the shaft. Now that shaft passes through this piece right here with a lot of contact points. As a matter of fact, that's probably why they put this wick, oil wick right here. And of course there's the usual oil wick on the end right here, which is for this end, but I use those sparingly. But it doesn't allow you to get to that. Now, it allows you to clean up the exterior of this and what you can reach right in here and right in there. But what I'm going to do prior to reassembly is to put gear lube right here, then stand this on the commutator end and let that run down, and then do the same on this end, put a drop of gear lube here, stand it on the gear end and let that run down. I don't think I'm going to drop any gear lube into this wick. I don't want to drop in low viscosity oil like 3-in-1 because I don't think it is as good as withstanding the heat and at high RPMs that the gear lube can, and prevent the long-term wear. But I'm going to give that a try. Of course, I'm going to carefully lubricate the commutator end of the shaft with gear lube as well, because it's going to pass into this bearing right here and actually come in contact with that washer. With that said, I'm ready to reverse the process and simply reassemble this. It shouldn't be very difficult. As a matter of fact, right up here, unless there's a problem with these springs that apply the pressure to the brush holder, I see no reason to disable this screw right here, because that screw holds in the brush mount and the spring holder and the brush mount and its plate. Now, unless you need to get these brushes off for some reason and replace them and their brush holder, I see no reason to do that. I cleaned up underneath it just a little bit to remove any excess carbon material, and that was it. Otherwise, they stay in place pretty well, and even if they don't, they're easily inserted, and then they can be re-engaged to the brush holder.